I never thought a simple patch of land could cause this much chaos. But the day I got that letter from the HOA, everything changed. They said my family's land wasn't aesthetically aligned with community standards. The same land my grandfather built from nothing. At first I laughed. I thought it was a mistake. But then came the warnings, the fines, the threats. One by one, my neighbors started turning against me. They whispered, avoided eye contact, even sent anonymous notes. And every morning, there was another notice nailed to my fence, each one colder, more demanding than the last. They wanted control. They wanted me to bow down. But what they didn't expect was that I wouldn't. When I refused to remove my animals, they called it a violation. When I parked my old truck by the barn, they called it unsightly. When I planted corn, they called it unauthorized landscaping. It stopped being about rules, it became personal. Then, one night, I heard footsteps outside. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across my fields. I watched from the window as figures moved near my fence, measuring, taking photos, trespassing on what was mine. That's when I realized this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pride, control, and the lengths some people will go to just to prove they're in charge. But they picked the wrong person to push. Because when you threaten a man's home, his history, and his freedom, how far do you think he'll go to protect it? When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought I'd found the perfect place to settle down. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine: white fences, trimmed lawns, quiet mornings with the hum of sprinklers, and families waving as they passed by. It was peaceful, predictable, and safe. That's what I wanted after years of working hard to buy my own land. My small farm sat on the edge of the community, where the manicured grass met the open field. I grew vegetables, kept a few chickens, and maintained a red barn that had been in my family for decades. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Every sunrise felt like a small victory, a reminder that I'd built something real with my own hands. My neighbors were friendly at first, small talk over fences, borrowed tools, smiles that felt genuine. But there was always one thing that didn't quite fit: my farm. Some saw it as charming, others called it different. I brushed it off. After all, I wasn't hurting anyone. But as the weeks turned into months, I started noticing small changes. The HOA president, a woman named Carol, began stopping by more often. She'd compliment my tomatoes, but glance at my old tractor like it was a crime scene. She'd mention community standards in a tone that felt less like a suggestion and more like a warning. At first, I thought she was just particular about appearances. But then came the letters, thin envelopes with HOA logos, neatly typed, always signed with her name. The first one was harmless, just a reminder about paint colors and landscaping. The next mentioned non-compliance with property aesthetics. Then, a warning about livestock restrictions. That one hit me hard. Chickens had always been part of my life, part of my family's way of living. They weren't a nuisance, they were heritage. Still, I tried to be polite. I attended meetings, smiled, explained my position, even brought fresh eggs for the board members. They thanked me with tight smiles and cold eyes. Every interaction started feeling like a test I was failing, without knowing why. Then came the stares. The same neighbors who once waved began crossing the street instead. Their greetings grew shorter, their smiles more forced. I started hearing whispers, something about rules, about not fitting in. My peaceful mornings now carried an uneasy silence. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if they sensed what was coming. I noticed Carol's car parked by my driveway more often. Sometimes late in the evening, she'd sit there, jotting notes, pretending to be on her phone. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. The air felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Then, one morning, I woke up to find a fresh notice pinned to my fence. Violation, it read, bold letters standing out like a wound. Apparently, my barn's paint was non-compliant with community standards. My barn, the same red it had always been, the same red my father had painted with his own hands decades ago. That's when it truly began, the slow unraveling of trust, the quiet hostility hidden behind polite smiles. What started as a few harmless letters was becoming something much darker, something personal. And as I stood there reading that notice under the rising sun, I couldn't help but wonder why this land? What did they really want? Little did I know that simple piece of paper was the first move in a game I never asked to play, and one I wasn't planning to lose. The days following that violation notice felt different. The air in Willow Creek Estates grew heavier, tighter, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for me to fold. I could feel eyes on me whenever I stepped outside, curtains shifting, cars slowing down as they passed by, whispers stopping the moment I looked up. The once friendly faces now seemed to wear masks of polite curiosity, their smiles paper thin. At first, I tried to ignore it. I repainted the barn, not because I agreed with them, but because I wanted peace. I used the exact same shade of red, but they still claimed it didn't meet community tone standards. They fined me $300. Then, another letter came, citing unapproved structural modifications. The modification: a simple fence repair I'd done to keep coyotes out. Another fine. It was like they were watching every move I made, waiting for something to punish. I started noticing Caro's SUV parked near the entrance of the cul-de-sac, her sunglasses glinting in the afternoon sun as she pretended to check her phone. She wasn't even subtle anymore. She wanted me to know she was watching. One morning, I came out to find my trash bins overturned, garbage scattered down the driveway. A note was taped to my mailbox that read, "Follow the rules or leave." No signature, just block letters scrawled in black ink. I reported it to the HOA, thinking they'd investigate. Instead, they sent another notice, this time about unsanitary conditions caused by trash left visible for over 24 hours. I laughed when I read it. It wasn't just control anymore. It was harassment. Every week, a new rule seemed to appear. No agricultural equipment stored on property. No livestock within community boundaries. No non-standard landscaping. It was like they were rewriting the rule book just for me. I tried reasoning with them, showing them the original community guidelines that said small livestock were permitted on properties exceeding a certain acreage. Carol looked me straight in the eye and said, "That section was updated last month." Updated. Quietly. Without notice, without vote. I appealed the fines, submitted photos, and attended every board meeting, but each time the decisions were unanimous. The board nodded along with Carol like puppets, their faces blank, their minds already made up. The more I fought back, the tighter they squeezed. My mailbox filled with violation notices, threats of liens, and friendly reminders that my membership in the HOA required compliance. Even my mailbox itself became a problem apparently. The post wasn't the right shade of brown. They fined me again. I started to realize that this wasn't just about aesthetics or rules, it was about breaking me down inch by inch. They wanted me to give up, sell, and leave, but they underestimated one thing: I don't back down from bullies. One afternoon, I set up a camera on my porch just to see who was coming by when I wasn't home. What I saw made my blood run cold. Footage showed two people, both members of the HOA board, walking across my property line, snapping pictures, measuring things with tape, and jotting notes on clipboards. Trespassing. I took the footage to the HOA office. Carol's reaction: she smiled. "We were just conducting an inspection," she said. "Perfectly within our rights." I demanded to see the documentation authorizing it. "There wasn't any. We don't need permission to ensure compliance," she said calmly, her tone dripping with condescension. That night, I sat on my porch staring at the horizon as the sun sank behind my barn. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down: years of work, family history, the land itself, all being dragged into some twisted power struggle. My father used to say, "When someone tries to take what's yours, make them regret the attempt." His words echoed in my head. I wasn't sure what regret would look like for them, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let them win. The next morning, I woke up to find survey stakes hammered into the edge of my property. Bright orange flags lined the border like warning signs. A note was taped to one of them: pending easement review. I hadn't applied for any review. When I called the county office, they told me the HOA had filed a boundary clarification request. It was the first step toward claiming a portion of my land as community managed space. Thus, as when I realized they weren't just trying to find me into submission, they were trying to take the land itself. My blood boiled. I gathered every document I had, deeds, maps, tax records, and drove to the HOA office. I slammed the papers on the counter in front of Carol and said, "This land is mine. You don't own a single inch of it." She didn't dare even flinch. "For now," she said, smiling that same practiced smile. "For now." I left before I did something I'd regret. But from that day on, something in me shifted. I stopped reacting. I started planning. I documented everything, every fine, every notice, every threat. I took photos, recorded conversations, backed up footage. I talked to neighbors quietly, asked if they defaced similar treatment. Some nodded, afraid to speak. Others denied it, too scared of retaliation. A few, though, whispered stories of their own fiends. For minor things, intimidation, unexplained fees, Carol had built a system of fear, and I was the first one to push back. That made me dangerous. As summer rolled in, the pressure mounted. HOA inspectors, if you could call them that, began showing up weekly, taking photos of my property. I stopped pretending it didn't bother me. I stood there, arms crossed, watching them until they left. I wanted them to know I wasn't afraid, but deep down fear was there. Not of them, but of what they might do next. And as it turned out, I hadn't seen anything yet, because the next letter I opened wasn't a fine, it was a warning of legal action pending. They were taking me to court, and that was the moment I realized the fight had just begun. The letter sat on my kitchen table for hours before I finally opened it. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rage simmering just beneath the surface. Notice of pending civil action. It read in bold black print. Beneath that, my name, my address, and a case number. The HOA was officially suing me for repeated violations, property depreciation, and non-compliance with community standards. They were claiming damages tens of thousands of dollars. My chest tightened as I flipped through the pages. The list of so-called violations was absurd. Non-standard fencing, unauthorized agricultural activity, non-conforming paint color, failure to maintain acceptable aesthetic. They even attached photos of my chickens, my barn, and my tractor as evidence. I almost laughed. Almost. But then I saw the last page, a request for a court injunction that would allow them to temporarily assume control of disputed property areas until resolution. They were trying to take my farm, my home, my legacy. I felt something inside me snap. For years, I had played by the rules. I'd paid dues, attended meetings, kept quiet when they nitpicked. But now, they wanted everything. I wasn't just defending land anymore. I was defending my life's work. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the dark outline of my barn, the soft glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the dirt. Every creak, every rustle of the wind felt like a warning. The next morning, I called a lawyer. He was a local guy, middle-aged, with that weary tone of someone who'd seen too many petty HOA wars. He listened to my story, flipping through my pile of evidence. "They're overreaching," he said, "but HOAs have power more than most people realize. They'll drag this out to make you quit." I told him I wouldn't. He smiled faintly. "Then you're in for a long fight." Weeks passed, and the tension grew thicker. HOA board meetings turned into public spectacles. They'd bring up my case like it was some community menace, warning others about non-compliance. I started noticing people avoiding me entirely. Parents pulled their kids away when I walked by. A couple of neighbors stopped returning my waves. It was isolation, pure and deliberate. One evening, I came home to find my barn vandalized. The doors were spray painted with the words "Get Out" in bright red. My tools were scattered, feed bags slashed open, and one of my chickens killed. I called the police. They took photos, filed a report, but said there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone. "Could be teenagers," the officer muttered. But I knew better. The timing, the message, it all pointed one way. The next day, Carol showed up with 2 board members, pretending to express concern. "We're so sorry this happened," she said, scanning the damage like she was inspecting a broken appliance. But incidents like this often arise when tension builds in a community. Maybe if you worked with us instead of against us, things wouldn't escalate. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. She wasn't just implying it, she was warning me. After they left, I stood in the wreckage of my barn, breathing heavy, anger boiling in my chest. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to destroy me, piece by piece. I was going to expose them. I started digging public records, meeting minutes, anything I could find. I discovered something interesting. The HOA had been quietly increasing administrative fees every quarter without community votes. Thousands of dollars collected with no clear accounting. I found vendor payments to companies owned by relatives of board members' contracts for landscaping, maintenance, even printing. It was corruption hiding in plain sight. I gathered everything, documented it all, and took it to the next HOA meeting. The room was packed. Carol sat at the head of the table, smiling that same smug smile. When they opened the floor for comments, I stood up and laid it all out: records, contracts, evidence. The room fell silent. Carol tried to cut me off, but the whispers started spreading. People began taking photos of the documents, murmuring among themselves. For the first time, her mask slipped. Her voice shook as she called for order, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. "These are baseless accusations," she snapped. But the damage was done. People were starting to doubt her. I left that night with my heart pounding, adrenaline rushing. I knew I'd struck a nerve. But victory didn't come easily. 2 days later, I received another letter, this time from the county zoning office. A complaint had been filed against me for unlicensed agricultural activity. Anonymous, of course. If proven, they could force me to shut down the farm entirely. It was retaliation, plain and simple. I felt trapped between a wall of bureaucracy and the shadow of power. My lawyer advised me to stay calm, but inside, I was burning. The fines continued, now weekly. My mailbox overflowed with letters. I started keeping them in a box, physical proof of every ounce of their harassment. Nights grew longer. I caught headlights lingering near my property line. Once, I saw Carol's SUV idling at the end of my driveway, headlights off. When I stepped outside, it drove away slowly, deliberately, like a wolf circling its prey. That was when I realized this wasn't about legality anymore. It was personal warfare. The court date arrived. I walked into that courthouse wearing my father's old flannel shirt, not out of defiance, but as a reminder of who I was fighting for. Carol and her board members were there, sitting together in their suits, whispering behind smug smiles. Their lawyer droned on about rules, bylaws, and property values, painting me as some reckless rule breaker who was bringing disorder to their perfect community. Then it was my turn. My lawyer presented the evidence. Every fine, every photo, every video of them trespassing, every record of their corruption. I watched as the judge's expression shifted, piece by piece, from neutral to uneasy. Carol's composure cracked just slightly when the video of the board trespassing played on the screen. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of my heartbeat. When it was over, the judge didn't rule immediately. He said he needed time to review everything. But I saw it out, the hesitation. They weren't invincible anymore. Still, the battle didn't end there. The HOA doubled down, flooding me with new fines even after the hearing. It was their last desperate grasp for control. But I was done being their victim. I started sharing my story online, posting the footage, the letters, the corruption. It spread fast. Neighbors began to reach out, some apologizing, others confessing their own run-ins with the HOA. The community began to fracture. The board's authority weakened as more people started questioning their decisions. And then, one night, something unexpected happened. A knock on my door. I opened it to find one of the board members, a younger man, eyes downcast. He handed me a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me," he whispered before walking away. On that drive were internal HOA emails, proof of coordinated targeting, discussions about making an example of me, even messages where Carol bragged about breaking stubborn members. It was all there. The next morning, I forwarded everything to my lawyer, the local news, and the county attorney's office. Within days, the story exploded. Reporters showed up at Willow Creek. Cameras flashed, microphones waved. Carol disappeared from public view. The HOA scrambled to hold emergency meetings, but it was too late. The truth was out. The lawsuit against me was dismissed, the HOA fined for misconduct, and Carol, she resigned, citing health reasons. But even after all that, I didn't feel triumph. Standing in my field, the wind brushing through the corn, I felt something else: relief, exhaustion, and a deep sadness that it had to come to this. All I'd wanted was peace. All I'd asked was to be left alone. Yet they'd turned it into war. The farm still stood. The barn still read. The chickens still pecking at the dirt. But nothing felt the same. The neighborhood's silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. Some people still avoided me. Others offered quiet smiles. But trust doesn't come back easily. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring out the window, waiting for headlights that never come. Maybe I won. Technically, maybe I kept my land. But deep down, I know the real cost. When power corrupts a community, nobody truly wins. Still, as I look out at my fields, I know one thing for sure. They'll think twice before trying to take what isn't theirs again. Because this land, this fight, this story, it's a reminder of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to tyranny. And for the first time in months, I finally breathe easy. The war is over. But the scars will always remain. The morning the hearing was set to resume, the sky over Willow Creek hung low and grey, the kind of heavy silence that feels like the world is holding its breath before a storm breaks. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, my mind replaying every moment that had led to this day. The fines, the threats, the vandalism, the humiliation, all of it had been leading to this final showdown. The courthouse loomed ahead like a monument to every fight I'd ever endured. I parked the truck, glanced at the barn dust still clinging to my sleeves, and took a deep breath. This was it, the day I'd either win everything or lose it all. Inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The both sat together in a row, perfectly coordinated, their expressions calm but cold. Caro wasn't there this time. Her resignation had come too late to undo what she'd done, but her shadow lingered in every glare from the remaining board members. Their lawyer, a slick man in a grey suit, adjusted his tie as I took my seat. My own lawyer leaned in. "Remember," he whispered, "they're going to try to discredit you. Stay calm. Let the truth speak." The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The attorney began with a speech about community order, standards, and the integrity of shared spaces. His words were smooth, rehearsed, dripping with the arrogance of someone who thought they were untouchable. He painted me as a defiant, disruptive homeowner, a man who refused to follow rules everyone else respected. As he spoke, I could feel my jaw tightening, my pulse pounding in my ears. But then, it was our turn. My lawyer stood, calm and deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not about community integrity. This is about control." One by one, he laid out the evidence. The photos, the letters, the videos. Then came the flash drive, the one handed to me by that nervous board member late at night. The room seemed to freeze when the first email appeared on the projector screen. Subject: dealing with the farmer problem. The words hit like a thunderclap. The lawyer's voice wavered as he read it aloud. It wasn't just a personal grudge, it was a coordinated campaign. The emails revealed everything. How Carol had instructed members to find every possible violation. How they planned to make an example out of me. How they even discussed using fines to pressure sale my property so the HOA could rezone and beautify the area for future development. Gasps filled the room. The board's attorney tried to object, but the judge overruled him. The truth was spilling out, and there was no stopping it. The next email was worse, Carol bragging about using county contacts to file anonymous complaints against me. Then, photos attached with mocking captions, calling my farm an eyesore and a relic. It wasn't just corruption, it was cruelty. My hands trembled as I watched. Not from fear, but from the raw flood of emotion. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, it all came crashing back. When the last email appeared, silence swallowed the courtroom. "Target achieved," it read. "He'll break soon." The judge's gavel struck once, hard enough to echo. "We'll take a short recess," he said, his voice tight with restrained anger. As people filed out, I stayed seated, staring at the blank projector screen. My lawyer placed a hand on my shoulder. "You just won the room," he said quietly. But I didn't feel victorious yet, because I knew the fight wasn't just about paperwork. It was about the damage already done. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed. Microphones pushed forward. Questions flying like bullets. How does it feel to be vindicated? Do you think the HOA will dissolve? I said nothing. The truth was still too raw, too heavy. I just wanted to go home. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My fence was gone torn down. The boundary line markers were uprooted, and deep tire tracks ran across my soil. My land had been invaded again. Someone had come while I was in court. I felt that same fire rise in my chest, hotter than ever. I called the sheriff immediately. When the deputies arrived, they examined the scene, muttering under their breath. It wasn't just vandalism, it was deliberate excavation. Looks like they tried to mark off part of your property, one of them said. Do you have any idea who might have done this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I already knew. The HOA was desperate, cornered, and striking back. That night, I sat on the porch, shotgun resting across my lap, the moon casting long shadows across the empty field. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the barn, the distant hum of a car set, my nerves on edge. They wanted me scared. But fear was gone now. All that was left was resolve. The next morning, I drove back to the courthouse, this time not as the accused, but as the man pressing charges. Trespassing, destruction of property, and harassment. I filed them all. My lawyer told me it would take time, but I didn't care. I was done waiting for justice to arrive. Was going to drag it into the light myself. The climax wasn't just happening in a courtroom anymore. It was happening here, on the land my family had bled for, under the same sky that had watched generations of us fight to hold our ground. And I wasn't about to be the one who broke the chain. The next week felt like the calm before a hurricane, a silence too thick to trust. Word had spread about the court hearing, the leaked emails, the corruption. The community was divided. Some neighbors quietly cheered me on, while others turned cold, afraid of being next. The HOA tried to hold an emergency meeting, but barely anyone showed. Their authority was crumbling, and they knew it. But desperate people make dangerous choices. It started with strange noises at night, footsteps crunching gravel just beyond the fence line, flashlights flickering near the barn. The cameras caught shadows, figures moving fast, staying low. Every time I called the sheriff, they were gone before anyone arrived. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was strategy. They wanted me tired, scared, off balance. I refused to give them that. Instead, I stayed awake, night after night, keeping watch. Each dawn, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking for new damage. One morning, I found another envelope in my mailbox. No HOA logo this time. Inside was a single photo. My truck, parked outside the courthouse, circled in red marker. Below it, one line scrawled in ink. You should have quit. My stomach twisted. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about revenge. I took the photo straight to my lawyer, who urged me to stay with family for a while, at least until the next court date. But I couldn't leave. If I ran now, they'd win. The law wasn't just property, it was proof that I couldn't be broken. Still, I started locking everything down, double-checking doors, adding floodlights. I even slept in short bursts, the shotgun always within reach. Then came the breaking point. It was a Friday night when I heard the first crasher window shattering at the barn. I bolted up, heart pounding, and ran outside. The cold air burned my lungs. My headlights cut across the yard, and in that beam, I saw them, two figures in dark clothes, running toward the back fence. I shouted, raising the shotgun, my voice raw with fury. Stop right there. They froze for just a second before sprinting into the darkness. I didn't fire. Not yet, but I made sure they heard the click of the safety releasing. The sound echoed through the fields, sharp and final. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. The sheriff's car arrived fast this time, lights flashing red and blue against the barn's side. The deputies combed the area, but the intruders were gone. What they left behind, though, made my blood run cold. Spray-painted words on the barn wall, sell or suffer. The deputies took photos, shook their heads, and promised to increase patrols. But I knew it was the HOA's last card. They'd lost control in the courtroom, so now they were trying to scare me into surrender. I wasn't going anywhere. The next court date arrived under the same gray skies. The HOA's lawyer looked rattled, less polished now, flipping through papers like a man trying to hold a crumbling wall together. My lawyer moved with quiet confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "we now have evidence of ongoing harassment and criminal acts linked to the defendants." He presented the photo, the vandalism reports, and the timestamps from my security cameras, all coinciding with HOA board meetings and messages. The judge leaned forward, frowning. The HOA's lawyer tried to speak, but the judge cut him off. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "your client's behavior goes far beyond administrative oversight. This borders on criminal conspiracy." The words hung heavy in the room. For the first time, I saw the board members' faces crack, fear flickering behind their eyes. My lawyer pressed on, showing the email trail from Carol that hinted at a plan to for sale properties for community redevelopment. The judge's patience snapped. "Enough," he said sharply. "This court will not be used as a weapon for personal vendettas." Then, turning to me, he added, "Mr. Walker, you've endured more than any homeowner should. Effective immediately, this lawsuit is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the state attorney for investigation into potential fraud and harassment by the Willow Creek HOA." The gavel came down like thunder. It was over, or at least, I thought it was. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters whispered furiously, cameras flashing. The HOA members scattered, some shouting, others frozen. I just stood there, staring at the seal of the court, letting the weight of it all sink in. Months of fighting, of sleepless nights, of fear and rage, of it crashing into one single moment of release. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. Reporters swarmed me again, but I just kept walking, past the flashing lights and questions, straight to my truck. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Justice had spoken. But the real climax came later that evening. I returned home, exhausted, expecting silence. Instead, I found a small crowd gathered at the end of my driveway, neighbors. Some familiar, some not. They'd come to thank me. One older man stepped forward, his voice trembling. "You did what none of us could. You stood up to them." A woman beside him nodded, tears in her eyes. "They made our lives miserable for years. You didn't just save your farm, you saved this community." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd felt like I was fighting alone. But now, seeing those faces, hearing those words, it felt like all the pain had meant something. The following days brought chaos for the HOA. Investigators seized documents. News crews camped at their office, and Carol's name dominated the headlines. HOA corruption scandal rocks local community. The headlines read. Lawsuits piled up against them from other residents, each story worse than the last. What had started as one man's fight for his land had turned into a movement. But even in victory, part of me stayed on edge. Late at night, I'd walk to the edge of my property, looking out at the fields. The barn, now cleaned and repaired, stood like a symbol of defiance. The wind carried a quiet stillness, the kind that only comes after a storm. I thought about my father, about the generations before me, who had worked this same soil, who had fought their own battles in quieter times. Maybe this was just my turn. And yet, as I watched the first rays of sunrise cut through the mist, I realized something deeper. The fight had changed me. I wasn't just a man defending a farm anymore. I was a reminder that when power turns corrupt, even the smallest voice can roar loud enough to shake it. The HOA could rebuild, rebrand, rename itself 100 times over. But the truth was out there now, carved into the history of this place, whispered in every corner of Willow Creek. They'd tried to break me. Instead, they'd exposed themselves. And as I stood there, the morning light catching the red of my barn, I said quietly, "You'll never take this from me again." The war was over. The land was mine. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel threatening. It felt earned. But as I turned to walk back to the house, I noticed something in the distance, a black SUV parked at the far end of the road. It sat there, idling, unmoving, watching. I couldn't see who was inside, but I didn't need to. Some ghosts, Dante is. I took one last look, then turned away. Whatever came next, I was ready. Because this wasn't just the end of a fight, it was the beginning of a legacy. And they would remember the man who refused to bow. The weeks after the verdict were the quietest I'd ever known. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the quiet that follows a storm that's torn through everything you love, leaving you standing in the ruins, unsure what to rebuild first. The court had spoken, the HOA had fallen, and the whole town knew the truth. Yet somehow, victory didn't taste the way I thought it would. It wasn't sweet or satisfying. It was heavy, bitter, and filled with echoes I couldn't silence. The news vans left after a few days, chasing fresher scandals somewhere else. The county launched its investigations, froze the HOA's accounts, and replaced its leadership with a state-appointed administrator. Carol's name disappeared from public view, but rumors spread fast. Some sighed she'd escaped town. Others said she was hiding in her house, afraid of retaliation. None of it mattered anymore. She was gone, and the machine she'd built was crumbling. My lawyer called it a landmark win. "You set a precedent," he said. "People will remember this case." Maybe they would. But when the lights go off and the cameras leave, it's not the headlines that linger, it's the memories. The vandalism, the threats, the fear of walking outside my own home. Those things don't fade overnight. I spent days cleaning up the aftermath, repainting the barn walls where they'd sprayed their warnings, mending the fences they'd ripped out, hauling away debris left by their last act of spite. Each nail I hammered back into place felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, but also a reminder of how easily it had all been taken away. Neighbors started approaching me again, slowly, like deer returning to a field after the hunter's gone. Some came to apologize. Others came to thank me. A few came just to talk, to finally let out everything they'd been too afraid to say. It turned out I hadn't been their only target. The HOA had been quietly squeezing people for years, threatening fines, inventing violations, manipulating votes. Everyone had just been too scared to fight. I listened to their stories, and every word felt like another stone in the pile of things I'd been carrying. It was never just about me. This whole time, it had been a system feeding on fear, and I'd been the first fool to push back. But I wasn't sure if winning was the right word anymore, because even after the headlines faded, the damage stayed. I couldn't sleep without checking the cameras twice. Every time a car slowed near my driveway, my pulse spiked. I kept waiting for the next letter, the next threat, the next sign that it wasn't really over. Trauma doesn't vanish, it hides in the routines of your day, waiting for a sound or a scent to wake it up again. Still, I tried to move forward. I reopened the small farm stand by the road, just like I used to. The first morning it reopened. A few neighbors stopped by. They smiled, hesitated, then bought fresh eggs and vegetables like old times. It was small, but it meant something. Bit by bit, life crept back into Willow Creek. The new administrator dissolved most of the HOA's bylaws, refunding illegal fees and voiding the unjust fines. The new board was to be elected fairly this time, under public oversight. But people didn't rush to volunteer. Too many wounds. Too many ghosts. I heard whispers of homes up for sale, families tired of the tension, ready to start over somewhere else. The neighborhood that once prided itself on perfection now looked fractured, raw, real. Maybe that was better. Perfection had nearly destroyed us all. One afternoon, I got a letter, not from a lawyer, not from the county, but from someone unexpected. It was from one of Carol's board members, the man who'd given me the flash drive. He didn't leave his name, just a short note. "I'm sorry for what we did. We thought we were helping. Carol convinced us it was for the good of the community. I see now it was for her own gain. I hope someday you can forgive us." I stared at the letter for a long time. Forgiveness. It sounded simple when you say it out loud, but it's not. You can forgive a mistake. You can forgive ignorance. But how do you forgive cruelty? How do you forgive people who took pleasure in your suffering? I folded the letter and tucked it away in the same box where ID kept every notice, every fine, every scrap of evidence from the war they'd waged against me. A reminder not of hate, but of what happens when people forget what community means. Months turned into a year. The seasons rolled by, painting the farm in colors that felt more vivid than ever. The corn grew tall again, the chickens clucked their soft rhythm, the wind carried that same smell of earth and life. But I was different. I carried the weight of it all, the fights, the loneliness, the loss of peace. It's strange how something so ugly can leave you both hardened and hollow at once. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch the reflection of my barn in the moonlight and remember the first time I saw the spray-painted words, "Sell or Suffer." I'd remember standing in the courtroom, facing them all, heart pounding but unbroken. And I'd think about how power works, how fragile it really is. It only takes one person saying no for the whole illusion to shatter. And that's what I'd done. Broken their illusion. But victory is a lonely thing. The people who cheer you on rarely understand the cost of fighting back the nights of doubt, the threats, the way you start questioning your own sanity when the whole world seems to turn against you. That's the truth they don't write about in the headlines. Winning changes you. It strips you down, forces you to see what matters, and shows you how thin the line between right and ruin really is. Sometimes, I'd stand at the edge of my land and think about leaving selling it, starting somewhere fresh, where no one knew my name or the ghosts that came with it. But every time, I'd feel the soil beneath my boots, the wind across my face, and I'd know I couldn't. This wasn't just land, it was legacy. It was proof that even against the most relentless odds, you can stand your ground and survive. Not without scars, but with strength, and maybe that's enough. The HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance was gone now. The wooden posts left bare. The grass around it had grown tall, wild, untamed. Fitting, I thought. It was beautiful in its own varial. Imperfect, alive, like everything they'd tried to erase. The second year after the verdict crept in without celebration. Seasons passed quietly, each one peeling away another layer of tension, yet never quite reaching peace. The farm kept me anchored. I still woke before dawn, fed the chickens, checked the fences, and walked the fields with coffee steaming in my hand. The rhythm of it was both healing and haunting. Every creak of the barn door reminded me of how close I'd come to losing it all. Sometimes I'd glance toward the road and see strangers slowing to stir curiosity. Tourists who'd heard about the farmer who fought the HOA. They'd take photos from their cars, then drive off, leaving only dust behind. I never waved. I wasn't a story for entertainment. I was a cautionary tale. The county's investigation stretched on. One by one, the former board members faced fines, lawsuits, or quiet settlements. Kara resurfaced briefly, issuing a bland public apology through her lawyer. Regretful administrative missteps. She called it, I didn't respond. What was there to say? Regret can't repaint walls or unbreak trust. Eventually, she sold her home and vanished for good. I thought I'd feel closure, but instead, there was only emptiness, like the silence after a scream. The new HOA, stripped down and rebuilt, sent out letters asking residents to participate in community healing forums. I threw mine away. Healing isn't something you schedule between coffee breaks and budget votes. It's something you earn, one quiet moment at a time. The neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to talk again. Some even helped me repaint the fence one weekend. It was awkward at first, guilt hanging heavy in the air, but work has a way of bridging silence. One man, Greg, who'd signed the petition against me back when this all began, leaned on his shovel and said, "You were right all along." I just nodded. There was nothing to forgive. Not really. Fear makes people do strange things. That night, after everyone left, I stood by the finished fence and realized something unexpected. The hate was gone. Not forgotten, not forgiven, just gone. Like an old scar that doesn't hurt anymore, even though you still see it. The land began to heal too. Where the survey stakes once cut through the dirt, wildflowers grew. The chickens were thriving again, their soft clucks carrying through the air. The barn stood firm, its red paint brighter under the sun. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. I used to think of home as safety. Now, I saw it as resilience. The ability to stay rooted even when the world tries to uproot you. Months later, a local journalist reached out, asking for an interview for a documentary on HOA corruption. I agreed, not for attention, but for truth. When the cameras came, I spoke slowly, carefully, choosing each word like a stone placed on sacred ground. I told them about the fear, the isolation, the absurdity of rules that value lawns over lives. I told them how easily power can twist good intentions into cruelty when no one questions it. The interview aired one evening, and I sat alone watching it on the old TV in my kitchen. My voice sounded older than I remembered, weary but steady. When it ended, I turned the screen off and sat in the dark, listening to the wind. Outside, the crickets sang, the same as they always had, as if the land itself was telling me it was time to let go. And for the first time, I believed it. Life settled into something resembling normal. The town moved on. New families arrived, and the name Willow Creek started appearing again in real estate ads, polished and rebranded. But those of us who had lived through it carried invisible marks. We'd nod to each other on the street, a silent understanding passing between us. We knew what had been buried beneath that shiny veneer of community. We knew what it had cost. Some nights, I still dream about the old days, about Carol's SUV parked under the streetlight, about the notices nailed to my fence, about the courtroom filled with whispers. In the dreams, I'm always standing in the same place, facing the same horizon, waiting for something that never comes. I wake up before sunrise, step outside, and breathe in the damp morning air. The earth smells the same, but I'm not the same man who once feared losing it. Victory changes you, but survival defines you. I started keeping a journal, not for publication, not for proofs, just for me. Page after page of memories, thoughts, and warnings. One line kept returning in my handwriting. Power only wins when good people stay silent. Maybe someday someone will read those pages and understand that this wasn't just a fight between a man and an HOA. It was a fight between control and freedom, between fear and courage, between silence and truth. And though I'd lost pieces of myself along the way, I'd gained something greater: clarity. The clarity to see how fragile peace really is, and how easily it can be stolen by those who think authority equals righteousness. One afternoon, about a year after it all ended, I received a letter from the county clerk. The case file was officially closed. The HOA's assets were liquidated, and restitution was being issued to affected residents. A small check was enclosed for me, compensation for damages, they called it. I looked at the amount, smiled faintly, and tucked it in a drawer. No check could buy back the nights I'd lost to fear. Money was irrelevant. What mattered was that my name was clear, my land secure, and my story complete. Or almost. The last piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. I was out tending the fence line when a car pulled up. A young woman stepped out, maybe in her early 20s, holding a notepad. She introduced herself as a law student writing a thesis on property rights. She'd read about my case and wanted to understand what it felt like to live through something like that. I hesitated, then nodded. We walked the property together as I told her the story, from the first letter to the final gavel. When we reached the barn, she stopped and said softly, "You must hate them." I shook my head. "No," I said. "Hate gives them power they don't deserve. I just remember." She wrote that down, eyes thoughtful. Before leaving, she turned back and said, "You know, most people would have given up." I smiled faintly. Most people don't know what they're fighting for until someone tries to take it. After she left, I stood there watching her car disappear down the road, and I realized that maybe that was the real victory. Not the court ruling, not the headlines, but the story itself being told, remembered, carried forward. Because as long as it's remembered, it can't happen again without warning. Years later, the farm still stands. The barn still glows red under the setting sun. But I've aged. My hands are slower, my steps heavier. Still, every time I walk the land, I feel its heartbeat under my boots. Quiet reminder that it's mine, not by right of paper, but by right of endurance. The ghosts of Willow Creek still whisper sometimes. When the wind cuts through the trees just right, I swear I can hear faint echoes of their voices, complaints, rules, warnings. But now, they sound small, powerless, fading into the distance. Maybe that's how peace sounds after all. Not silence, but the soft retreat of old fears. On the anniversary of the verdict, I sat on the porch as the sky turned gold. I thought about everyone who had stood on this land before me and everyone who would after. The land endures. People come and go. Rules change, names fade. But the soil remembers. It remembers who protected it, who tried to own it, who stood their ground when the world turned against them. And maybe that's enough. Because in the end, no court, no board, no piece of paper can truly own what you've bled for. As the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon, I whispered to the wind, not in anger, but in gratitude. For the fight, for the scars, for the lesson that came at such a cost. I won, yes, but the truth is, no one walks away from a war like that untouched. I traded peace for justice and found that justice has its own kind of silence, a heavy, echoing quiet that lingers long after the shouting stops. And so I sit here, on this porch, watching the fields sway, knowing that what I defended was more than land. It was dignity, it was memory. It was the simple right to live without fear on the soil that bears your name. And as the wind carries the smell of rain and earth, I finally let myself exhale. Not because I'm free, but because I survived. And survival, I've learned, is the closest thing to victory that life ever truly guarantees.